All down. All silent. Going. Gone. So congratulations.
Welcome to the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate. Each episode, we chat with real estate author and industry leader Peter O'Malley to discuss the current property market conditions and provide insights to assist you on your property journey.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Current Market Insights. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Brien, and with me is Mr. Peter O'Malley. Peter.
Hi, Ciaran. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Peter. I want to talk today about a few things, particularly the real estate market, as we always discuss. But given that just recently we've had another rates decision by the RBA, I thought it might be worth having a bit of a chat about what that decision means, what it is going to do to the property market. And then given that we're headed towards Easter, where you think the market's going to go. And I've had some interesting conversations this week myself with a few people who are interested in real estate. And one of the things they've sort of said is that they feel like there's zero activity at the moment. Not much interest from buyers, not much interest from sellers. It's a bit of a weird time. So given we've had all these things happen with the RBA and what's going on in the global economy, given that we're headed towards a holiday period again, I'd really love to get your thoughts on where we're at and where we're likely to head.
Yeah, thanks, Ciaran. So, look, in a surprise to no one, the RBA did increase interest rates on St Patrick's Day in March. But what was a surprise to a lot of people, Ciaran, is it wasn't a unanimous decision by the RBA board.
Right.
They were 5-4 in favour of a hike.
Interesting. Okay.
Now, I saw one commentator say, and this was said without basis, that the four dissenters on the rate hike were not really against a rate hike notionally. They were against the timing of a rate hike here and now. All things considered, there's no doubt the RBA did the right thing to increase interest rates on St Patrick's Day by 0.25%, as you say. I've read their statement. It's a fairly vanilla statement in a fairly dramatic time that they've issued. And essentially what they're saying there, for those that haven't read it, is there was too much inflationary pressures in the domestic economy before the Middle East conflict kicked off.
Yeah.
So when you extrapolate out, and it's an expectation that the Middle East conflict is going to be bad for inflation, and push it up further, they were left with no option but to go with a hike here and now. The money markets firmly believe they'll go again in May. They probably will go again in May. That's on Tuesday, May the 5th. And I think you'll see a lot of vendors that will be trying to trade between now and the 5th of May and avoid being exposed to the third rate hike of the year.
So when we talked about the last rate hike, not that long ago now, you predicted that there might be a bit of a flurry if there is, I guess, an indication or an inkling that there might be a May rate hike. Obviously, the economy changed and a few things happened. I think one of the phrases I heard was there is toxic inflation at the moment, now, which is pretty strong language. I know you say that the statement is quite vanilla, but the language around it has been very, very clear.
Oh, the RBA statement was vanilla relative to what was going on. They sanitised a lot of the issues that are out there, but there's no doubt as to the seriousness of things,
Yeah. Look, it's I know we talked about this and you have predicted there will be some activity. So I guess in keeping with that, if there is likely a May rise, then you probably bang on that there is going to be increased seller activity trying to exit the market before that happens. I'd love to get your thoughts. I was talking to someone about this rate hike, and almost as if it was the first time they fully understood what was happening, they said to me, but it's only 0.25%. That's not too bad. And, I had this kind of conversation with them around, it sounds great. And we've had this argument before with why does a 0.25% rate rise impact rents so much, et cetera, all these flow-ons. But it made me realise that I think there is so much negativity and financial doom and gloom and end-of-the-worldery in us at the moment that they went, it's only 0.25%. Like, that's not terrible. And I'd really love to get your thoughts on whether you're having conversations with people where you think that they're actually underplaying how serious these changes are because of just how chaotic everything else is at the moment.
Oh, look, everything is chaotic, but I would say sentiment of the day is not underplaying this.
Yep.
No, I would say broadly speaking, and we come across all, cross sections of society, and I think people are fully aware of how significant this is, because you've got a template for where we're at now, and that's what happened in the 70s when Iran and America went at it back then. Now, there's strong suggestions that inflation is headed towards 5% plus.
Yeah.
And how do you control inflation of 5% plus? You have an interest rate setting or a cash rate of the day of 5%, which is a mortgage rate.
Of 7 to 8. It's chaos.
Correct.
Yeah. I dread the thought of that, honestly.
Oh, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
You're not the only one, and hopefully that doesn't come to pass, and hopefully the government's got some solutions up its sleeve, and seeing that this is on the horizon is going to help the economy, avoid running straight bang into the mountains, so to speak. Cutting back on government spending would be one way to help ease the inflation. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
The RBA don't want to smash the economy against the rocks, but as you would have heard, Ciaran, the recession word, we're on track for a recession, is now being widely used.
Yeah.
And I have little doubt that if interest rates, or cash rate, I should say, was to go over 5%, meaning mortgage rates, as you quite correctly say, are heading towards 6, towards 8, I think you would find the economy would be in a downturn.
Do you think that the Albanese government would use this opportunity to say it's the recession we have to have, Peter, if we got to that point?
There's no chance they will use those words. But, and I've said this before, maybe not in our podcast, but I was at school when Paul Keating uttered those words. And when you watch where things are at the moment, that's a poor choice of words, but equally I understand why he said it.
Yeah.
Because there is times in a cycle where the only thing that fixes the trajectory you're on is a recession.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I agree with you that Albo won't say it, but I find it, somewhat poetic that we could end up with another Labor government all these years later. Not necessarily off the back of their own.
Just on politics, I'll say this. Jim Chalmers, I've had a lot of time for Jim Chalmers' messaging throughout his tenure to date as Treasurer. But I've just found in recent months, he's on the TV trying to cushion the blow and distance his government from what some of the things that are happening out there. And he's trying to, a little bit like COVID, people are trying to tell you that what you're seeing is not what's happening.
Yeah, it's
like
fake news, mate.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. And
I don't think that's endearing Jim Chalmers to anyone. And as I'm not being political here, is that one of the best things that a government can do when things are sliding is acknowledge a bit and how we're doing better, and this is what we've got to do, where he seems to be falling into this trap at the moment of none of it's our fault.
Yeah. It's I cannot think of, we will move from politics, but I cannot actually think of anyone in the past 6 to 12 months who has anything positive to say about politics. And that's unusual because I'm someone who's, as you know, I'm quite invested in politics. I've been very involved over the years. I have a lot of connections and friends that are in the sector. And I don't think anyone, even amongst my closest friends, has any positivity that's coming out about anyone at the moment. And I find that really interesting. And I find it interesting that Chalmers is using that messaging, and I agree. But it can't be missed, just in the news cycle this week, talking about how this government has record immigration numbers and how pumped they were about it and what it's doing for supporting the economy at a time where we're facing, utter collapse, which is just, it baffles me.
Yeah, well, unemployment unsurprisingly jumped back to 4.3%.
Yeah.
And Jim Chalmers came out and took a bow for taking, for the job creation.
Yeah.
And it's like unemployment's gone up and AI is kicking in, and companies that are significant employers like Atlassian cutting back 10% of their workforce and doing it via email. That's going on in the real world, and Jim Chalmers is taking a bow for job creation at a time of fragile employment conditions. So I'm just not sure he's reading the room at the moment. As I say, I think his opening start as a term as Treasurer was commendable. He had rapidly rising inflation on his watch, not of his doing, and he had to make sure that there wasn't a big jump in unemployment, but he had the right level of spending in place to help the RBA bring it down. They got rewarded at the election, as we know, in May 2025 with a thumping majority. But just in the last few months, I'm not sure he's reading the mood.
Yeah, I don't think any of them are. Going back to the RBA statement, I'd be interested to know from your experience or knowledge, when was the last time that you can think of, if it was recently, that's on me, but when was the last time the RBA did have dissenting votes on a rates decision? Do you know?
No, well, I can't remember a 5-4 of this, and I have no doubt that it's happened in the past, but I can't remember a 5-4 split.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good question you ask. Maybe under the new doctrine of the RBA that we didn't actually get to hear what the votes were in the past.
Potentially, yeah. And
in previous statements that we've read for our podcast audience, we've always said that the decision was unanimous.
Yeah.
Where this was, a sub-story to the main story when the decision was announced that it was a 5-4 split. But some will say it's only around the timing of the hike.
Yeah.
Others might read more into it and say that people were saying in this environment, smashing households because the Strait of Hormuz is closed is not the solution.
Yeah. Well, look, time will tell whether it's the right decision, that's for sure. So more practically then, given that you have been out on the ground, you've got buyers and sellers you're working with at the moment.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the last rate decision 6-7 weeks ago, and then let's move forward to this one. Have you seen a shift in the sentiment out there in the conversations?
Big time.
Yeah?
Big time.
Which side primarily? I know you mentioned sellers are more cautious now and potentially looking to go earlier, but are you seeing conversations now on the buyer side that makes you think maybe they're just getting some pause or having some concerns themselves about whether they can finance their purchase?
Look, I think it's a bit of all of that. So let's talk about the February rate hike, Ciaran. There was no war at that time. The war broke out on in terms of Australia's time and Iran time. It broke out on Saturday, February 28. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first rate hike, no one wanted it. Everyone accepted why it had to happen. No one was surprised when it was announced. The war broke out on February 28. The Labor government through March have cleared the way for a capital gains tax increase on property landlords.
Yeah.
And then here you are on St. Patrick's Day getting another rate hike with talk of inflation, going through 5%, which would mean at least another 2 rate hikes from there.
Yeah.
So the market sentiment is not driven by the fundamentals of this situation at the moment as you and I are talking. It's driven by sentiment.
Yeah.
Like there is no doubt there's home buyers that have dropped out of the market and said we'll go to the sidelines and watch this. So while things are happening, we obviously reference the gold price regularly. That was edging up as the conflict was kicking off to $5,400 US. This week it's dropped back to $4,500.
Yeah.
There's talk that the Gulf states, which are obviously effectively shut down at the moment as the missiles are flying about, and they're not earning the money that they were selling their gold onto the market to keep their economies ticking over. I don't know if that's fact or not, but that's the sort of high stakes poker that's being played out there at the moment. When it comes to the domestic property market, auction clearance rates were in the low 40s last week. We're recording this on a Saturday. I just spoke to an auctioneer just to get a sense of how his day was. He had 4 auctions, all 4 sold, but he said very, very tough. So when an auctioneer says they sold, but it was very, very tough, take it as read that there was probably 1, maybe 2 bidders that turned up.
Yeah.
It passed in and they went inside and ended up having a negotiation over a couple of hours. And that seems to be the mood at the moment. There's still enough buyers in the market. There's still enough buyers that are prepared to transact, but I can't think of a sale in recent times that you look at it and go, that got overs.
Yeah.
And you may remember a few weeks ago, before the war started, I was even saying then that the sales that are happening at market price. And at that stage, I could only think of one sale, an apartment in Rozelle, that I would say, hey, that got overs for what it was and what it achieved. I haven't seen anything get overs in terms of market price relative to sale price in the last 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah. So I guess before we wrap up then, pragmatically, as the principle of your business, are you fielding more calls after this second rate hike than you might have been earlier in the year, just from people who are potentially testing the waters? Are you getting more responses from people that you're talking to about, market appraisals or potentially looking to sell? Is there, is the actual, in your market that you service, are they as impacted by these decisions, do you think? And is there that, obviously we're talking sentiment based, are there people more responsive to at least listening at the moment?
Without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, okay.
So sometimes when you're hunting around for new business, people sort of tell you to rack off. But now, even if they're not interested in doing business, they'll say, tell me how are things out there at the moment? What is happening? What is the sentiment? So when it comes to sentiment, I'll tell you what the public's not missing at large, Ciaran, the amount of auctions that are being postponed.
Yeah.
So even those that are not active in the property market as a buyer or seller are saying, I see a lot of auctions are getting postponed at the moment, which they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, as we record this, last night, Trump said that he's going to grind Iran down until they basically give up. And then 90 minutes later, he said we might turn the war off soon.
Yeah. I mean, he said something similar last week. He said, the war's ongoing, and then not long after said, actually, it's basically done. We're going to wrap up and come home.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen?
So the US stock market, had over a 1% correction on Friday. And after hours on Friday, it jumped. It ended up 1% positive after the close.
Yeah.
When Trump said we're going to wind the war down soon, and here we are today. Who knows what he's going to say tomorrow? So that's part of his MO to let nobody know what he's really thinking. And they're pretty wild times. So we're not pretending to be geopolitical experts here. What we're saying is that when you see all of these events happening, how's the poor home buyer or home seller meant to make, stable decisions or decisions they're comfortable with for the long term in this environment? Sellers who need to sell.
Yeah.
If you're one of those unfortunate people who purchased a property in February and said, oh, we've got a great house, we'll have no problem selling this. You can always sell a property, but sometimes at a price.
Yeah.
And buying before you've sold in this environment is near on a reckless move, just due to the dramatic nature of events. So we are listing people, saying if events escalate and the war front gets worse and there is a massive market turn at some stage during your campaign, we'll call it, and there's no hard feelings. They're the conversations I'm having when I sign a listing up at the moment.
Yeah. You're front running this, but who knows?
Well, I'm front running it because in my time selling real estate, I've sold real estate, and this is the level I put the current environment on during the 2001 attack in the US, the Iraq War, the 2008 GFC, the pandemic, of course, and
Afghanistan war.
That didn't impact on markets like this did. There was a sense, if I go back to the Iraq War, in society and in the property markets, like you're taking on Saddam Hussein. You've told us for the last 4 or 5 months that he's very close to developing a nuclear weapon, which is why you've got to do it. What if he's got one? The Ba'ath Party, you might remember the Ba'ath Party, supposedly formidable army. America are boots on the ground taking them on day one, essentially. There was real angst around that at the time.
I joined the military not long after, actually.
Yeah, right.
So I know too well. I think I honestly feel that was a period, though, where there was a massive global shift, just in thinking, in people's kind of safety net. That was a fundamental 5 years between sort of 99 and 2004, I think. Yeah,
well, look, we're kind of living a parallel thing here, right, where everyone was horrified with October 7 in Israel a few years ago. And that was an attack on the innocents, as September 11 was. And then 2-3 years later, the adjunct of that, whether it was a direct line there or indirect, you had the Iraq War. Well, here we are, direct or indirect, from October 7 to Israel and America. taking on Iran in this fashion. So, and then the other major event I had, in selling real estate, which we've all lived in recent times, was the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there are times where the property market seizes up and says we don't know how to trade, so we won't trade. And the only ones that really do trade in those times and those periods that I've just mentioned are the people that have got financial duress. They see an opportunity, or they've been caught on what I call caught on the turn, and they've bought a property and they need to sell their property, and that they're at the mercy of the market of the day. And because over 26 years of selling real estate, I've seen 5 or 6 of these events. This is why I never go into a listing and tell people, go out and buy another property, and then you'll be able to sell this, no worries, in 4 or 5 weeks. Because when you see people caught in a bad environment, having bought elsewhere, must sell, and everything's against them, it's life changing. It's a horrible scenario.
Oh, they can definitely they can lose it all. Final question for you then, before we wrap up this episode. We spoke recently with Mike Salvatzis, a buyer's agent, who talked about his experience with the investors coming back into the market. So the usual questions I always ask you about the market: are you seeing any investors come in? Obviously, this is not the time for investors, so I'm intrigued to see if your experience recently aligns with what he was saying. But 2, what has been your experience in the rental market recently? Because I feel like the conversation around the rental market has actually stalled a little bit. It's no longer the hot topic it was for much of the last few years. Not saying it's improved, but I just want to get a sense, because I feel like the heat is off the topic, so to speak.
The heat is off the topic. You're absolutely right, Ciaran. That's not because anything's been fixed or resolved, but how long can the media keep shoveling a message down the public's throat before the public says, I know that, I'm not interested anymore. So the media, which is understandable, are in the entertainment business. You must keep that in mind. And hearing about rental queues when you're talking about rising interest rates, rising oil prices, Dubai airport being bombed, the Middle East on fire, and Trump giving contradictory messages every 90 minutes. In terms of the news cycle, the rental...
Referencing Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that.
What about that for interaction? So in that context, the rental market doesn't rate an iota, but underneath all of that, tenants are having to pay higher rents.
Yeah. All right. Look, really great discussion today, Peter. It really is fairly uncertain times. Obviously, we have some idea of what's coming in property to a certain degree, but I think, as you say, with so much volatility across the globe, we really don't know what we'll be talking about next week or the week after, given things are shifting. But as always, I do value your insights. I value your experience. I know our listeners do as well. So thanks for coming in and talking with us.
Oh, happy Easter to you too, Ciaran.
And happy Easter to you, my friend, and happy Easter to all of our listeners out there. And thank you for tuning in to Current Market Insights. We look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate, the podcast providing real estate insights you won't find anywhere else.